Hello everyone. Los Angeles, a city that never sleeps. Amidst the bustling sounds of vehicles and the dazzling neon lights, there is a small, simple house filled with peace. This house belongs to Ahmed, a devout Muslim man. Although he lives in the heart of a busy city full of distractions and worldly temptations, Ahmed always keeps his heart calm and close to Allah. Every day, he performs his religious duties with sincerity, praying 5 times a day, reading the Quran, and praying with a heart full of hope. However, that night, the tranquility that usually enveloped his home was soon disturbed. The air, which had been hot and scorching, suddenly became suffocating. Strong winds began to blow, carrying the smell of smoke that grew stronger. Outside his house, the sound of fire truck sirens and the cries of panicked citizens filled the air. Something terrifying was happening. Ahmed walked to the window and saw a horrifying sight. A huge fire was bursting out from a building in the distance, and in an instant, the fire began to spread, devouring everything in its path. Nearby buildings were catching fire, and panicked people were running in all directions, trying to escape. The streets were filled with chaos. But despite the fire getting closer, Ahmed's house remained calm, as if nothing could disturb the peace inside. Meanwhile, Ahmed's heart trembled. He knew the fire could threaten his home, but he also knew that life was in the hands of Allah. He hurried to his prayer room, performed ablution, and prayed 2 rak'ahs. With every movement in prayer, he felt himself growing closer to Allah. His restless heart began to calm, and he focused his mind on one thing, praying with all his heart. After the prayer, Ahmed raised his hands with sincerity and prayed, "O Allah, you are the most protecting. Protect me, my family, and this house from any calamity. Do not let this fire reach us. We can only surrender to you." Outside, the fire continued to approach. The surrounding people were running to safer places. However, something was strange. Even though the fire had already consumed the houses around Ahmed's, it never reached his house. It was as if an unseen force was blocking the fire. The fire continued to come closer, but for some reason, it seemed unable to reach Ahmed's house. Ahmed felt something different. His heart, full of peace, made him more certain that this was Allah's help. But he didn't want to overthink it. All he knew was one thing: he just needed to surrender, pray, and trust in him. The fire continued to spread rapidly around his house. The streets were filled with thick black smoke, and panic grew. But Ahmed's house remained intact. Everything happening outside seemed to have no effect on his humble home. Ahmed felt a miracle was unfolding, but he didn't feel the need to seek further explanation. He knew this was Allah's mercy, protecting his servant who surrendered to him. The peace inside Ahmed's home was in stark contrast to the raging fire outside. With each passing second, the fire grew closer, yet Ahmed's house remained unshaken. Ahmed sat against the wall, with prayers constantly rising in his heart. Everything around him was burning, yet he felt as if an invisible wall was protecting his home. But he knew, this wasn't just about the fire. It was a test from Allah to examine his patience and piety. In his heart, he remembered the words of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, prayer is the weapon of the believer. He believed that sincere prayer could change everything. With a heart full of conviction, Ahmed continued to pray, hoping for Allah's protection. The tension that night grew more intense. The people who had initially fled in fear were now beginning to sense something strange. The fire, which had once been huge and ferocious, seemed to halt just a few meters from Ahmed's house, as if it could not cross a certain boundary. The panicked people running toward shelter stopped and stared at Ahmed's house in awe. "How is this possible?" one of them whispered. Yet Ahmed remained calm. He knew that even though everything appeared terrifying, he had to hold on with prayer and faith. A sense of greatness filled his heart, and he simply surrendered to Allah's will. Everything that was happening was part of a greater destiny. The night passed with tension still hanging in the air. Thick black smoke continued to rise high into the sky over Los Angeles, and the sound of fire truck sirens never ceased. The streets were full of panicked people, rushing to find safer places. Yet, there was one house that stood firm, untouched by the flames: Ahmed's house. the fire, once so fierce, began to die down in most areas. The homes around Ahmed had been reduced to ash, leaving only ruins and charred debris. Yet Ahmed's house, which was only a few meters from the raging fire, remained untouched. Those who witnessed the scene began to question what they were seeing, astonished by the sight. Some of the survivors started to approach, still feeling panicked, but there was one thing that made them stop in front of Ahmed's house. They saw, with their own eyes, that the house, one that should have been an easy target for the flames, was still standing. There were no signs of fire whatsoever. The windows were wide open, and the sturdy wooden doors remained neatly closed, while outside, the world was being consumed by flames. "How is this possible?" one neighbor asked, his voice trembling as he looked at Ahmed's intact home. A few people began to whisper, trying to find a rational explanation, but none could provide an answer. They saw Ahmed's house, which was so close to the fire that it had devoured everything else around it, still standing untouched. This was no coincidence, they thought. There must be something extraordinary behind all of this. Ahmed, who had been sitting against the wall with prayers continually resonating in his heart, finally stepped outside of his home once the fire began to subside. His face remained calm, without any visible fear, only serenity enveloping him. He knew that what had happened that night was not mere coincidence. The surviving residents began to gather outside his home. They wanted to know how such a massive fire could come so close, yet Ahmed's house remained untouched. Some of them approached, sensing that there was something different around Ahmed's home. "We saw the fire so close," one neighbor said, "but it seemed to avoid this house. What happened?" Ahmed smiled, but didn't say anything. He simply gazed at them with eyes full of peace. "This is Allah's help," he answered softly. "Only Allah can provide such protection. I just prayed, asking for His protection, and placed my trust in Him." The people who heard Ahmed's response fell silent for a moment. They were shocked, but in their hearts, they knew something greater was unfolding. This wasn't just about luck or coincidence. It was about a miracle that could not be explained by human logic. Ahmed invited some of the residents to enter his house. They sat together in the simple living room, which had been untouched by the fire. Outside, the ruins of burned houses were still billowing smoke, but inside Ahmed's home, there was an extraordinary sense of peace. The residents who sat there began to feel calm, despite the panic and fear they had felt earlier. "When we place our trust in Allah," Ahmed said gently, "we must believe that He will provide protection, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Nothing happens without His will." Ahmed's words left a deep impression on everyone who heard them. Those who had been full of doubt began to open their hearts to better understand the power of prayer and piety. What they had witnessed that night was not mere chance. It was tangible proof that Allah, in all His power, always hears the prayers of His servants who are sincere and full of faith. Day by day, the story of Ahmed and the house untouched by the fire spread throughout the city of Los Angeles. The news became a hot topic among the residents. Many came to Ahmed's house, wanting to learn more about the extraordinary event. Some came out of curiosity, others sought an explanation, and some simply wanted to hear the story of a servant's firm faith in his Lord. But for Ahmed, this story wasn't about him. He didn't want to be praised or remembered as a hero. For him, the most important thing was the message he wished to convey, that piety, prayer, and trust in Allah are the keys to protection in this world full of trials. Ahmed continued to live his life in simplicity, never seeking attention. He knew that life was merely a trust, and the most important thing was to draw closer to Allah with every step he took. The story of Ahmed's house, untouched by the fire, serves as a reminder to all of us of the power of sincere prayer and unwavering faith. In every trial, even when the fire of calamity surrounds us, if we place our trust in Allah, nothing is impossible. Allah will always protect His servants who are full of faith and sincere prayers.